Okay, this week we are talking about institutional diversity. And when it comes to institutional diversity, it's really important to have sources for extensive information about the various types of institutions that we find throughout post-secondary education in the United States. And so there's a separate video that I've recorded and is posted here in week 2 about finding information about institutions. And in that video, I provide an overview of the Carnegie classification system, as well as the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System, or IPEDS. When we talk about institutional diversity, we can think about it in terms of these 5 different aspects of diversity. And I'm going to provide a little context and background for each of these and also touch on the readings that addressed some of the theory about institutional diversity. So first on that list was systemic diversity. And with systemic diversity, we look at a number of different elements of institutions. And the one that I'm going to highlight here is institutional size, which would be number of students enrolled. As you read research in the field of higher education, one of the things that comes across is that we see a lot of representation of large or very large institutions. And so if you might get a perspective that that's what dominates the landscape of higher education institutions in this country. But if you look at this chart, you see that large and very large, or the largest segments, are actually a very small proportion. But even the label of large and very large can be misleading because really we're talking about a pretty wide swath of institutions. So depending on where you look, large institutions could be 10,000 students or more, so Murray State University would be considered a large institution. Other places define large as being 20,000 or more, or 15,000 or more. And so we lack some specificity of what exactly those labels mean. When it comes to programmatic diversity, that's all about these different areas: the mission of the institution, the degree level that is awarded, so what's the highest degree that's awarded by the institution, the degree areas that are offered or emphasized, the extent to which the institution is comprehensive. And so that's one of the things that if you look at information about Murray State University is that part of our definition, and it's listed in our mission statement, is that we are a comprehensive institution. And that means that we offer a range of degree levels. So at Murray State, we actually offer associate's, baccalaureate, master's, and doctoral degrees, as well as certificates in a number of areas. And so in the video about the databases, one of the things you'll see is that there are some very specific institutional types based on degree level. And many of those, so let's say that an institution only awards the baccalaureate degree, it would not be considered a comprehensive institution. The same goes for an institution that is exclusively graduate. It would not be considered a comprehensive institution. Procedural diversity is in reference to what is the dominant form of instruction that is emphasized or offered to the institution. So is the institution known largely as a lecture institution? Not that students sit through boring lectures for every class period, that they physically go to class in a lecture type of format. And of course, there could be different types of activities that take place in the classroom setting, but lecture reflects a particular type of instruction. Experiential. Now, many programs have some sort of experiential component to them through different forms of supervised practice. Your doctoral program is one of them. But there are institutions that place a heavy emphasis on experiential learning as the predominant mode of instruction. Of course, we have institutions that exist largely in the online realm of learning, and that becomes their primary means, or the means by which they're best known as an institution. And then there's a group of institutions that throughout the course of history in American education have been known as experimental. And without going into too much detail, because that would be the topic of a different video altogether, these institutions have sought to approach learning in non-traditional paths. And some of those experimental institutions were experimental because they represented a blend of different types of instruction. So they may have had some lecture components. There may have been a lot of experiential learning. But one of the things that a number of the experiential or experimental institutions featured was self-directed learning for the students. So if you're familiar with the Montessori approach to education, where the student explores whatever path of curiosity that is sparked at a given time. That was something that was popular in a number of experimental institutions. You notice I'm speaking in past tense about experimental institutions because that's when most of them existed, was in the past. Many of the institutions struggled with coming up with a really a concerted sense of what a student would gain from attendance. So some of them were able to award some sort of degree or certificate, but didn't really reflect what we would consider to be a consistent approach to general education, which would be a course of study grounded in liberal arts. And many of them struggled financially, and it was ultimately the financial struggles that led to most of the or all of the experimental colleges going away. There could be still some floating out there today and things popping up, although things that I've seen that would be akin to experimental institutions exist in small pockets within larger institutions. So constitutional diversity is looking at the makeup of the student body and how that makeup of the student body relates to other elements, including the makeup of the faculty, the focus of student services, student aid awards that are available, and the influence of outside groups. Prestige is a big topic in talking about institutions of higher education. There's an author named Zemsky who based this taxonomy that we see on the screen for prestige on selectivity. So we perceive highly selective institutions to be more prestigious. Name brand are those that anyone on the street probably knows the name of and thinks that there may be some competition for gaining admission. Core are also typically recognizable names, but are seen as more open to more people. Based on the U.S. News rankings, about 20 medallion institutions make up the top 50 of the U.S. News rankings, and then about 20 name brand, and then about 10 core. And so obviously the core is the biggest chunk. This is the bulk of the institutions. They may not all be recognizable names, but you hear the name of it and you say, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. I'm sure that's an institution. So for folks who are not from this part of the country, you say Murray State, and if they pay attention to ESPN, say, oh yeah, they've got a great basketball program. If not, they say, oh well, it's got the word university in it, so it's clearly it's a college of some sort. Where is it exactly? Name brand, I would say that would be most state schools. So University of Kentucky, University of Louisville, Auburn University, the University of Florida. University of Texas. Texas might actually be on the cusp somewhere between name brand and medallion. Medallion institutions, we usually often think about them in terms of being the Ivy League schools. But the thing is, some of those Ivy League schools, some people actually haven't heard of, or they're not part of the lexicon that we might think they are. But the medallion institutions are those, they've got the name recognition, but you say their name and everyone automatically thinks, oh, they're the best of the best. So on the private side, this would be Harvard and Yale, probably Duke, if we're in the South, Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt's on the cusp of medallion and name brand based on Zemsky's model here. So when you heard the term institutional diversity, or as you read it, as you looked over the course as we began this summer, I just want you to think what type of division first came to mind. Did you envision there being different categories of institutions? If you ask anyone whether or not they're associated with higher education, what's your public perception? What are the kinds of institutions that are out there? You might get a response that includes public, private, and for-profit, although I don't know how many of the general population would differentiate for-profit from private. If you ask a sports fan, you might get a division that looks like this. It's either a football school, it's a basketball school, or you wonder if they have sports at all. Or if you base it on movies and TV, it's Harvard and then everyone else. Well, the reality is that post-secondary education is incredibly diverse. We see a wide range of institutions based on size and setting. And this is broken down with a little more detailed explanation in the video on the databases of Carnegie and IPEDS. But you can see there's a wide distribution among a number of different institutional types. And if we break it down even farther, based on the type of the highest degree offered and some other factors associated within that category, we see there's even more diversity. One categorization that you sometimes hear is Research 1 versus Research 2. And that demarcation is actually based on old language from a previous version of the Carnegie classification system. And the Carnegie classification system was updated in 2005. And with that, we got the language of research intensive or doctoral universities, high research activity, moderate research activity, and we got research university intensive and research university extensive. And one of the things that I think surprises people is that when it comes to the number of institutions, there's actually a pretty even split between 2-year and 4-year institutions in this country. And something, I don't have a slide for this, but when we look at enrollment, the numbers are actually right here as well. Roughly 47 to 49% of all undergraduate students are enrolled in 2-year institutions. So even though we've put a lot of our attention on the 4-year institutions, obviously 4-year institutions get the attention in terms of funding from states. Even when it is cut, they still get more of the attention from funding. 2-year institutions actually dominate, or don't dominate, they're an equal player in the landscape, both in terms of number of institutions based on the very basic classifications, but then also based on enrollments. So why does institutional diversity matter? Well, one way to think about it is the debate, or not really debate, but this divide between elite and mass education. So one thing that I didn't touch on in the history videos, although I hinted at it, is that higher education was the right of the sons of wealthy landowners for quite a while here in the United States. It wasn't until after the Civil War that we saw greater access made available. And that came about through the passage of a piece of legislation at the federal level that was sponsored by a senator from Vermont named John Morrill in 1862. And that act became known as the Morrill Act, and it established the land grant colleges. And so these are the A&Ms. So Texas A&M, Auburn University is an A&M school. The University of Wisconsin is actually a land grant, both land grant and flagship. Same thing with the University of Michigan. And so the focus of these institutions was to focus on the agricultural and mechanical arts. So agriculture, we get that. Murray State obviously is a very strong series of ag programs, and the mechanical is actually engineering. So the mechanical arts. The first engineering programs were those of mechanical engineering. And then there was actually a second Morrill Act that was passed in 1890, and that provided federal lands and federal dollars for the establishment of colleges for the education of freed slaves and their descendants. And so that provided for what we now know as the historically black colleges and universities. So just a little bit about applying and thinking through the theoretical constructs that were presented in the readings this week. So one concept that was addressed is that of population ecology. And one way to think about this is Darwin's perspective on survival of the fittest, that institutions have to adapt in order to survive. And so I talked about the experiential colleges, and that is ultimately the financial struggles that cause them to close. And that's generally what causes institutions to close today, unless they're merged with another institution by legislative fiat. But a lot of what has pushed institutions to close has been a lack of responsiveness to the environment. So maybe an institution, and we've seen this a lot more with private institutions than any publics that have closed or faced merger over the years. Institutions who say, no, we know what our core identity is, and we're not wavering from that. And then the next thing you see is that their enrollment drops by 25% the next year, and they dig in their heels and say, no, we know what our core values are, we have to strengthen around those, and then their enrollment drops again, and little by little the institution is dismantled, and then ultimately it closes. Resource dependency, this is what we're seeing play out with the budget fights in the Commonwealth of Kentucky right now, is that we are reliant upon, as a public institution in the Commonwealth, we are reliant upon the state government for a particular portion of our funding. And as that is diminishing, and there are threats for further diminishing, we realize just how reliant and dependent we are on that set of resources. And one of the things that we see is that institutions, it goes right along with population ecology as a theoretical construct, is that with resource dependency, we see very directly what the effects are of reductions in those resources. And so we know, I mean, we're dependent on resources to operate. Any nonprofit organization or any profit organization is reliant on a series of resources in order to operate. But when we see drastic cuts taken in a very short period of time, we see just the extent to which resource dependency plays out. We can see this at play in other states as well. Some wonderful case studies, which are really not wonderful, but rich case studies, are to look at the states of Louisiana and Illinois for some very real examples of what's happening to institutions and the ways in which institutions are forced to respond to continued reduction of the resources upon which they were really built to be dependent. And then the last one, and this is where we'll wrap up this video, is institutional theory. And so I've got Descartes here with his famous saying of "I think, therefore I am." And institutional theory posits that institutions exist when we name them as such, that there's nothing magical about what comprises an institution. Last week we talked about some common characteristics, but when we think about institutional diversity, yes, there is great diversity among institutions based on size, setting, or population served, degree programs offered, and so on and so forth. But there are also a number of common characteristics that those institutions share. And it's the sharing of those characteristics that allows us to define them and categorize them as institutions.